Thank you, Daniel, and of course thank you to everyone who's had a hand in organising the events today. So Selina, Andreas, Trajika, Rolf, Daniel. And yeah, my name is Chris Solarski, and my specialisation is applying classical arts techniques to video games. But I wanted to make this presentation more general so that whichever creative field or even in non-artistic fields, if you're working in something, then really to find a way to see new, to develop ideas and also find relationships between disparate reference sources. And it's based on my book, sort of a part of this presentation, a part of some of the concepts that I developed for video game art, drawing basics in video game art. So the first thing, I think the biggest challenge that we all have is sort of this white canvas. So when you're starting a project, the idea that you really have a really difficult starting point. It's like what do you put in this empty space? And this is often the block that people have, sort of, really to get into a project. It takes a lot of energy to get going. If you do have ideas, you're given a brief and you do have ideas, then it's good just to get them out. Put them down on the paper, but you often find that these initial ideas are usually quite the cliched ones. They're the ones that pop into your imagination, and they're the ones where, in a way, by putting them down, you can sweep them away and then start the real research and move on from there. And so, for those who don't have an initial idea, the idea is, I think, what I enjoyed is a quote by Carolyn C. from Making a Literary Life. And what she wrote was that, what's your inner voice talking about these days? And by that, it's like the idea that we all sort of talk to ourselves, so to speak. So please don't make me feel like I'm the only one who does this. But it's something that we all do. We're constantly talking about, what situations at work, sort of in life. And so these are things which are very important to you, obviously. So there's what your inner dialogue is discussing all the time. And as an artist, these are very useful because if you start to develop a project really based on something which means a lot to you, because you're talking about it all the time with yourself, you'll have a lot more, a stronger connection with your work. So there's something that you can really reference in a much stronger way than sort of relate, just basing it on something that you read about, that doesn't have such a strong emotional connection for you. So it's always this, what is the emotional experience you want to create? So ideally it's something that you can connect with, but otherwise it really is, if it's a website app, if it's an urban space, an event sort of environment, what is the emotional experience you want people to have? It's not about the style, style comes later and it's something which develops from the emotional experience. So this is, what kind of sensations you want people to have. And so the development process, I'll use this chapter on character development, so it's very much focused on developing characters for video games, but it's this very, very general process, and one that we're all familiar with, I think, from school, where you develop a high concept, so it's just a paragraph which really summarizes the emotions that you want for this experience, and so it's full of adjectives. So for this character, which even the name isn't important, is what kind of sensations you want this character to have. And sometimes it's very useful to also consider the opposing keywords, because it's usually through contrast that you can really sort of communicate the core message. So if you want to communicate beauty, some sort of ugliness in there, or like a contrasting concept, will help to heighten that sensation. And once you have that, it's just putting this concept in the middle of a mind map or a spider diagram. They have different names, and using sort of more nouns. So you're starting to combine these adjectives with actual objects. These are just references, just ideas that you can use to get your imagination going. And the idea is you're just combining adjectives with nouns. So, for example, flora, and natural beauty, and delicate. It's like, what does it mean to each one of you? What comes to mind? And it's just using these initial ideas, and nothing should be rejected, no matter how weird or unrelated it seems. If something comes to mind, it's important to you. So go with it and investigate it. And so for me, it was just the abstract shapes of leaves. I thought this was something which I could start with. And it's also a very good iconic shape, sort of this leaf shape, and it's something that I can use to base my character on, because I want to find something which really embodies a lot of these key words. And so just quick studies. The idea is, we have this white canvas initially, but already by combining these nouns and adjectives together, I have some research to do. I go on the internet, I look at leaf shapes, and just start sketching. These are so small, so quick, they're not detailed, and so you're already starting to work. Your white canvas has got some images on it finally, so you're getting over this hurdle, because it's often the energy to start something original takes a lot more than it does to just copy, just to study. And you're slowly just getting a feeling for the shapes, in the movements of your drawings. What does quiet visually mean? So you're trying to find visual solutions for these words. So in this, for quiet, I looked on the internet and I found that a lot of images which are quiet have a lot of horizontal lines, verticals that may be balanced in the frame. So as well, this is what quiet means to me. But the problem is that you often have so much rubbish to sift through in Google image searches that it's your job to curate the images, and based on your experience of how images work, you can sort of more quickly find what the solution is. Because quiet might be someone holding their finger up to their lips, which in an abstract sense doesn't communicate things as well as these empty spaces. Cultures and strange natural beauty. Again, this, what does that mean to you? And the beauty of this process is that you could give the same template, this mind map, the high concept to lots of people, and everyone would do different research and find a different solution, because we're all different. We all have different personal experiences which would guide our creative process in different ways. So for me, it was just an interest in sort of tribal cultures, and I looked up African clothing, and it was just finding just doing very, very quick sketches. Some of these are 30 seconds, sort of just a minute or two, and also just slowly start making connections. The more you research, the more you sketch, the more sort of this character starts to just appear. You're constantly just reinforcing these adjectives and finding visual solutions for them. So even at this stage, I started to think, well, my character, maybe I want it to be in this leaf shape. So clothing like this is a good way of simplifying the human form. So I can slowly start to use this maybe change the outline, change the silhouette of the character. And then I just thought, that looks much like a poncho as well. So I started to combine these two concepts together. These dying leaves, so this feeling of delicacy as well. Slowly this character comes together. Delicate and quiet. Every part of the figure has to be considered. All the time there's so much research that you have to do. So how does the figure stand? So I thought, the ballerinas tiptoeing on their toes is very delicate, or someone standing like this. Also I just thought, well, insects also have a very delicate contact with the ground. So even though this may seem inappropriate to study the legs of a grasshopper for this kind of more human-like character, I still did it just on the off chance that it might provide me with inspiration. So nothing should be rejected. So as this creativity is important, there's an important part of creativity to always push, never sort of assume that something isn't relevant. And even the eyes, shape should the eyes be? You know, I want them to be quiet in a way, but also echoing this overall concept. So if the leaf is an icon, so it's like this visual DNA that I want to use for this character, also the eye has to maybe take on this leaf-like shape. So it's always thinking, you know, what is the overall concept I want to communicate, and saturating everything with as much of this feeling as possible. And then it just comes, you know, a difficult part is always, how do I turn all these shapes into a character? And if you just think of that a character has to have a head, body and legs, then you can turn these shapes, you know, use it as a headgear, clothing, sort of combine them together. And just through sketching all the time, trying to combine these shapes, they slowly develop into a character which has these visual metaphors integrated into it. You know, and once we add colour, you know, we can sort of finish with a final design, sort of that. But the idea is that you're not finished even at this stage. The idea is this is just one character, and you immediately have to start questioning, you know, whether it's appropriate, what could you improve about it, reference the high concept at the beginning, does it really communicate what you want, and then start investigating. And then this is where your creativity increases, because you start to have questions about the design, and you start to look in reality, sort of what really reinforces your design. So the idea is that you're always looking for these visual metaphors. You know, what are these visual metaphors which are sort of solutions to these word concepts that you start with? And this is just a video from Coca-Cola, which, I had a hard time finding suitable things, but it's just in a more mainstream advertising product. See how many references to the bottle and also to the Coca-Cola swipe that you can see. It's actually two videos, one longer one. So it's all the time just saturating your design with this visual DNA. What is the core message you want to communicate? So, you know, the developers of this animation could have thought, you know, we're just going to have the trucks going along a straight road. But the idea is, why not shape it in the shape of this logo of Coca-Cola? You know, all the time, you know, how can you echo these fundamental concepts? So this is one approach, but you know, and James W. Young in his book A Technique for Producing Ideas said something very interesting, is that an idea is nothing more nor less than a combination of old elements. So this is in a way the process that I've just described, that you're taking things from reality and combining them into something unique. But the second stage is the capacity to bring old elements into new combinations depends largely on the ability to see relationships. And so as an artist, so especially if you do drawing, you find that reality is so complex that you need a system to simplify. So classical artists doing life drawing really had to reduce the figure to concepts of box forms, cylinders, and then the anatomy would be overlaid on top of this, because we're not machines. You know, the reality is just too complex to render otherwise. And so artists generally live in this world of abstraction, that, you know, a tree trunk is cylindrical, just like my arm can be described as a cylinder. And so to illustrate this, you know, there's one thing, on one level this is sort of a combination of visual metaphors, but on the other, sort of I have this line going down the middle which references these images of silence. And they have a very real application. So these, you know, what I talk about these a lot, so the circle, the square, and the triangle. Because throughout history they've had very specific uses. So with the circle, Generally, it was used to communicate youth, energy, femininity and innocence, maturity, stability and balance for the upright rectangle, and aggression, masculinity, and then force for the triangle. And what these relate to, so everyone's feeling self-conscious about it. Very Freudian. What this actually relates to is real-life sensations, what we associate with this. So imagine having all these objects on a table. If I move the table around, the ball would roll around and maybe roll off. So this is where this dynamic energy comes from. Whereas this cube would stay fairly static. So it's like this idea of stability. Whereas if I took each of these objects and I threw them into the audience, you'd be a lot more hesitant catching this one because of your experiences with sharp objects. As a child, you've learnt, what sharp objects are. You should treat them carefully, and this becomes a shorthand. Like we don't even have to know what an object is. As long as it's sharp, we're automatically hesitant towards it. Whereas catching a ball is something we do instinctively. If it's a football or anything with a soft edge. And this translates to reality. So it's not really a formula for designing ideas, but it's just a way to conceptual lens to see relationships between things which may otherwise seem very disparate. So this one has a lot more energy, whereas this, and more delicate, whereas this building definitely is very sharp and looks more aggressive. Whereas the National Gallery is based, on this idea of the Greek columns, this idea of stability and balance and maturity. Why many of the Greek temples are still standing sort of in, like basic shells at least, but this stability is sort of pervasive. So all these concepts are pervasive. Also in how you dictate, how you influence the way the person influences a three-dimensional space. So, even just visually, how does this feel to walk, along this? So actually just look at it versus a straight road, maybe triangular ones. But also you're visually influencing the emotions of the person standing in this space, but you're also trying to guide them. They might be tempted to walk in or cycle along this path in a very different way. So this is just a pattern. You can actually design pathways like this. So in parks, we have much more delicate, many times it's more delicate lines, curving ones, whereas when we go to work, we just want straight lines which are very direct. Whereas angular ones, tell a different narrative, sort of a different emotional message. And you can combine these together if you're creating an experience like a story or a video game. The idea is you slowly combine these together because they all have different emotions they communicate. So it shouldn't just be all the whole environment should be like this, but change the experience as the person travels through these spaces. In vehicle design as well, what's the Volkswagen Beetle is based on the concept of fun. Usually you would go sort of have a surfboard strapped to the roof. This car is more about stability and safety, aggressive speeds, and the idea is that you what I like to point out is that these cars could all have no engine inside them. So they're just pieces of metal and glass. But you would have to, we would all have to push them down the roads to get them moving. But we still would get an impression that this one would be maybe heavier and more stable. This one we could maybe flick and it would fly off. But it's really, in reality, they have no function. Maybe they all weigh more or less the same. So it's really we do read books by their cover, based on these surface shapes. Why logos, sort of this sort of maturity, high fashion perhaps, why Disney has more rounded curves, to communicate this energy, all the time. So and Anthrax, the heavy metal band from the 80s, 70s, you just imagine swapping them over, so Disney would be written in a more aggressive font. The message would be wrong. What the Disney wanted you to feel, and it should, like every logo, every font should summarize what the whole experience is for this company. So it's very important that you choose something appropriate. and even in gestures, when you're looking at, you're trying to design a character, so, what are the gestures that we use in every day? So something's very delicate, you have sort of a particular sensation, much more rounded, curved movements. If someone's very slow, they might fold their arms like this, and again, they're communicating this idea of stability, that they're not going to budge. Whereas a more aggressive movement, and also the gestures, what are they like? And now I'd like to also show that it's applicable to music. So if you imagine, you can close your eyes and sort of imagine yourselves as music conductors. So how you would conduct this kind of music. And there will be 3 songs. So it's sort of these themes are, work across many levels of audio and visual. And in video games as well, this being my specialization, think about sort of what Mario represents, this very strong dynamic energy, youthful as well. Whereas the other 2 characters are just morphed versions of Mario. And if we ignore the proportions of these 2 characters, what Wario, Mario's enemy, represents is just a sharpening of the shapes. So they've just taken the round Mario and sharpened him. So it's really just dialing these shapes from one to the other. Whereas Luigi, more the upright characters, looks more mature and a balanced person. Even the posture they've given him. So it's always just, this helps us to find relationships between seemingly disparate reference images. And so just to finish off, I'd like to play 3 videos from 3 video games, really to show that video games are quite a complex system of all of these things working together. So as you're watching these video game videos, consider what the inspiration might have been for the character's movement or the environment, what the background is like. So we looked at the buildings, how they sort of can be used to communicate emotions, pathways through the environment, and the animation and the music. So it's also imagine yourself as if you were conducting the movement of the character. So you're a music conductor, but the thing that you're conducting is a video game character on screen, and how all these things are working together. Okay, so it's sort of this creativity, or sort of the success of your creativity really depends on having this visual fluency, understanding how images communicate on this very, very abstract level. And sort of combining these cultural icons, things which also cross over into your personal experience. So there are sometimes images which speak to a broader group of people, sometimes they only relate to something that you've experienced yourself, and it's combining them to make sure that you can communicate to more people, I think, rather than producing something for yourself. I think in the mainstream product, if you're doing fine art where it's more about sort of your own personal experiences, this is a painting about your life, then cultural icons are not so important. It's more personal experience, but it's creativity that depends on all three. And also just in terms of narrative, imagine I showed you 3 games which communicate very different emotions, but to combine these concepts together, so you can create many times more sort of complex narratives and complex emotions if you start to combine them together. And in video game design especially, we're very guilty of creating these games which just are very shallow, they're all about shooting or having fun, whereas if you start to combine these like film does, the story changes all the time in a good film. So you have emotional sort of moments, very aggressive ones, funny ones, all in one film, and it's the same thing can happen in urban planning, sort of in events management. When you're thinking about the experience of the person walking through the space, it's not just to think it has to be one, but it can vary. You can add more texture, variety in the texture of the experience. So I think, this, if you want to read up on what I do, then you're welcome to follow me or visit my website. Thank you. It's a very real thing. The advertisers use this to influence you in the ways that Daniel described. But it's also rooted in these are very traditional principles. They go back to ancient Greece and very much so in the Renaissance as well, where the paintings that were being produced were in a way religious propaganda. You were supposed to go to a church, and many of the people were illiterate anyway, so these images were speaking to them on this very psychological level. And so it's something that's been used throughout art history, where, especially in the past, it was where paintings had a very real purpose. They were commissioned to communicate something. And the idea is that artists, if it's a personal project, this is the visual language. It's just like words. If we're using words to manipulate people or images, it's as in advertising, it is, you could say, manipulating. In art, you can say influencing emotions. They're both very well connected.
Just see that Coke is dark.
The idea is many artists, this is something that's been, with modern art, these concepts are in a way have been eroded away slightly, because modern art deliberately tried to cut itself off from classical art. So understanding all these techniques, it became more about self-expression, and it was a very good thing for art because it allowed people to explore new ways of painting and drawing. But it's still to communicate something. As an artist, in a way, you're just like when you're writing something, you want somebody to feel an emotion. If it's a novel, you want them to go through a similar experience that you had in mind. So as an artist, you're using these to really tell a story visually, sort of without this need for dialogue or animation. But images all work in the same way. So advertising, also uses text and images. But these are techniques which have been around for over 2,000 years, and everything you see has influences you in that way, whether the artist was aware of it or not. And a lot of artists are not aware of these techniques in these times because of this modern art, pushing away classical art theory. But it's coming back slowly. People it seems are tired of not knowing what they're doing in a way. So at art schools it's a very big frustration that students want to learn how to draw figures and things, but the education system doesn't really support it in a lot of places, and a lot of people are very hungry to rediscover these classical techniques. Yeah, because I think the problem is more, for me, when I also mentioned that topic, it's that the artists who were responsible for this transition from breaking away from classical art, the early modern artists, they were still taught the classical approach. Matisse, for example, he was very frustrated with his students who would come to the atelier and try to paint like him straight away. You know, he was very frustrated, and I think he quit because of that, because he wanted them to study the classics first, so they understood these methods of abstraction. And what's happened now is that we've had more and more of these students maturing into artists, and so they, what I would say is that, modern art, because it's finally did away with all of these concepts, and tried to give you sort of a more direct impression. So often the artists that are creating no longer understand how to structure an image, and so they think that this symbolizes everything that I had in mind. I'm expressing myself, but the general public is very, I would say, confused by modern art. You can buy books on understanding the Dummy's Guides to Modern Art. It's when you really do away with these classical principles, which is the visual grammar, how we communicate visually. It becomes very difficult for your audience to identify with you, and it's usually critics and really people who are in the art scene who understand these images, whereas others have to read the text to fully understand. So it's sort of a drawback for the artists themselves. There is that side to it, but this is more, it's like our reaction to the aesthetics, how they change, how the brushstrokes we use, how the images were constructed. People like Van Gogh were being inspired by the photographic camera. They had the ability to go outdoors, and were criticized for the sketchiness of the paintings, of the colors and things. But in looking back, we can still see a continuation of the concept. Just it's a separation of the style and sort of the social context in which these images were created, and the visual grammar, the craft which these images were created. And these are lasting principles which go back to ancient Greece. And if someone doesn't use these, it's just like writing a speech in English, but not connecting the words, using the grammar. It's sort of you can talk for 30 minutes, but no one will make any sense of what you're saying. It's it's a combination of these two. Understanding how to communicate is still fundamental, and if someone hasn't understood these basic techniques, the artwork will never fully make sense unless you've read the little description on the wall, what it refers to. Well, they already do in some way, like the aesthetics that we see of advertising and film. Films are sometimes based entirely on a video game concept where the character has to level up.
So they don't know better, the artists who made the film, because they are referencing a video game instead of referencing Rembrandt, Van Gogh, or whatever.
No, it's not about, because what I want to highlight is that these techniques are not about the finished style. That there really is a separation of these two concepts. That what I'm showing is just how you construct the image, and how you can influence the emotions. But the things which relate to your question are more about the social implications, how we can reference, how we can use modern culture as a basis for a film.
Yep, but do kids nowadays, 12 to 14-year-olds or 8 to 14-year-olds, do they think that video games made this world and fantasy, or do they know that themselves they are referencing on Van Gogh and Rembrandt and all the old masters?
No, it's sort of very hidden. Like in film, what I found is that the film designers are much more aware of classical principles. I think the level is generally higher, and because it used to be, it's slowly changing that film had a much higher esteem. You know, if you were an artist at the top of your field, you wouldn't work in games. You would work on a big blockbuster film. Whereas video game consoles are becoming so powerful, and the experience is more emotionally rich. Slowly, there's still a transition happening now, where people are slowly either working in both industries or slowly moving to games as the medium grows, because the aesthetics of games are still being discussed. You know, we still don't fully understand sort of how to create these more complex narratives, and it's an ongoing process, but it's slowly, not referencing, so the ability to not even just reference a particular type of video game or Van Gogh. So the idea is that if you've trained yourself well enough, it doesn't matter what your topic is, so you should be able to find inspiration from everywhere, because the language that we speak is surprisingly abstract. It can be reduced to quite simple elements, and how you dress this up later depends on the time that you're living. So the language works on the psychological level, and then we have impressionist style put on top. We have video game style dressing this communication up. But with video games, of course, the thing which hasn't happened before was this element of interactivity. So we have these images on screen. Now they've become dynamic, just like in animation and film. But also this idea that why I wanted you to imagine how you would conduct these video games is because at one level we're either holding the PlayStation controller or even just doing gestures. So this interactivity is also part of the aesthetics of video games, how you feel when you move these characters around the environment. But there again, they're not a revolution. Why games have had a hard time is maybe because we focus too much on conflict and very aggressive games. But there is it's not a revolution again. Like it's an evolution of what's come before, and understanding how these shapes relate all to each other helps us to have more control over the emotional experience, and then how we dress it up. Like with an aggressive game, it might be very difficult for people to see the aesthetic quality in a violent game, but it still communicates something. But it's how you can use it or what you can learn from it is equally important.